Hello, and welcome to the first episode of my review of Blades in the Dark. In this episode, I will be discussing the action system of the game. So, by the action system, I mean what is usually called the score component of the game. However, because the components of those game systems apply to free play as well as certain parts of downtime, I'm calling it the action system instead. And what this really is a kind of conversation system for making collective judgments about the fiction. Um, this is something I've talked about a lot in my series Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. Um, However, it is something I wanted to evaluate in addition to simply talk about in that series. In that series, I was talking about the rules and how to learn them. Here, I want to talk about how they actually work in my experience at the table. So my first impression, or my first takeaway from the action system, is that generally speaking, the GM tends to bootstrap the system for everyone at the table. This means that although the system is conversational, it's meant to be conversational. In practice, what ends up happening for the most part is that the GM tries to teach the rules to the players, and so at the beginning there isn't really very much of a conversation happening. It's much more the GM offering a list of options or the GM trying to teach a certain aspect of the game to the players, and there isn't really very much of a back and forth going on. The back and forth is very stilted. What this means is that something I'm going to come back to again and again in this review is that Blades is a very difficult game to get off the ground. My first time running the game was a complete disaster. It was very rough. It was disorganized. The players did not know what they were doing. They felt like they had no opportunities for role playing. I felt disoriented. I felt like I had too much to teach them. It was just a complete mess. The second time I tried to run the game was much more successful because I was playing with players who already knew how the game worked. However, my third time playing the game was once again quite messy because I was trying to use the starting procedure for the game with players who were not familiar with the rules. And therefore, the conversation was very awkward. It didn't work very well. So I've seen this also in watching Scum and Villainy on Friends at the Table. The first couple episodes of the series that they did with Scum and Villainy was very, very stilted. The players are struggling with the rules. Austin is struggling to explain them. I see this again and again. I've seen this with Lowell Francis trying to run the game for new players and absolutely struggling to teach it. So very experienced GMs who know the rules, but who are really, really struggling to get it off the ground. This is persistent across examples that I've seen, and the way you can kind of get around it is by having more players in the group who know the rules already. So that conversational aspect of play and the shared authority between the player and the GM in making judgments, it leads to a very, very rocky start. And so that's a key feature of Blades in the Dark that I wanted to outline. So the other side of the action system, however, is that it has its real moments. This is especially the case when you are a player and you feel like the system has given you an opportunity to be heard, right? If something's going a way that you don't particularly like in many game systems, you would just have to cede authority to the GM or to the flow of the narrative, or to the moves, the rules. However, in Blades in the Dark, there are many opportunities for you as a player to state what you want and to have it heard and to have a conversation proceed from that. And that is not something that is simply a part of play culture, because to some degree, play culture can ameliorate any rough system, any system that tends to silence player initiative. That can be ameliorated through informal procedures or hacks of the game that can allow for more conversation and more dialogue. However, in Blades in the Dark, that's baked right into the action system, the core of the game. And when it works for you as a player, it feels really good. And as a GM, it's relieving because you feel less stress because you have to do less intuiting of what it is players want. You have to do less reading of their body language. You have to read less into their words or into what they do, and try to find some kind of hidden subtext behind their actions that you have to intuit and then somehow adjust your GMing to fit. John Harper, when he was on Narrative Control with Sean Nittner, he talked a lot about how he didn't want to GM as a director. And I think the rules of Blades in the Dark do a lot to get the GM out of that director role and make them a co-participant in the structure of the narrative and in play. As I mentioned, the downside of that is that it tends to lead to very rocky starts because the players have much more responsibility than they would in many RPGs, many tabletop RPGs. And there's a clash of play cultures that happens. So, the main point I wanted to say about that conversation, that shared responsibility, is that as play proceeds, both the GM and the players feel ownership or feel responsibility for the outcomes that are reached, because the judgment over the way play went was collectively reached. And so in a game like Blades in the Dark that is very high stakes, and that tends to be very high pressure, regardless of what the text says, I feel that unless you're playing with the optional Gambit rule, Blades in the Dark is a game that tends to crank up the pressure. And because the responsibility between the players and the GM are shared, those responsibilities are shared, it means that it's okay with everyone at the table when things crank up, right? It is not something that the players approach as children and the GM approach as a parent, right? It is not one person setting the rules, laying down the law, and the other people accepting it or throwing a fit over it. Because the decisions were reached collectively in the context of the rules, the players may revolt against the rules, right? They may feel that the game is too high pressure, but they're not going to make it personal, right? It becomes much less of a matter of sort of charismatic rule. Like, to put on my academic hat, I feel like we're moving from, a sort of a charismatic kind of rulership in the GM world to a rule of law, a rational system of rule in the Weberian sense. So, that's interesting, right? That is an interesting innovation in game design, not without its downsides, but certainly does have advantages as well. The next thing I want to talk about is the dice system in the game. I don't have too much to say about this, but just a few comments. In my experience, having played Blades in the Dark without the die system that uses, and instead substituting in the PBTA standard 2d6 plus a modifier system, the dice system that Blades uses and moves away from PBTA is necessary for the way the game works. The 2d6 plus mod system doesn't work. It does not work well at all to try to fit into the system of progression and the system of bidding that is characteristic of Blades in the Dark. And what this system does, the D6 dice pool that can be modified up or down, what that does is it gives room for advancement and for bidding up rolls. So both things are made possible. There's a space of play that is opened up by that dice pool, which allows for satisfying and rare crits, but also the possibility for the players to make risk-reward decisions based on their stress budget, based on making devil's bargains, based on helping each other, based on defending each other. Many different decisions the players can make and have them feel meaningful within the context of the rules without overpowering the players, without making them just crush through every opposition they could face. So I think the dice system is a little bit more complicated than what PBTA does. However, it is nevertheless valuable and worthwhile, and I think it works. So about risk versus reward. One thing to mention is, you can really spend your stress budget, you can spend your resources to get yourself in a position as a player where your chances of failure are very low. For example, if you spend up to having 4d6 in your dice pool, it means that your chance of a miss is rendered down to a mere 6%, right? So you're like, oh wow, maybe that's too strong. But no, it isn't, because when you make the decision to buy up to 4d6 from a starting value of 2d6, which is the highest you can start at, you're spending a lot of resources, and that implies a lot of future risk. You're deferring risk. You're not eliminating risk, you're deferring it, and you're potentially inviting more severe risk, because the devil is better than the devil you don't. And when you spend those resources and you invite the possibility of taking trauma or of the devil's bargain blowing up in your face, then you are entering into a situation where you don't know what the consequences will be. And so there's interesting decision making that happens for the player, and it feels dramatically satisfying. So I think the dice system is very good in this game. It works very well. Next, I want to talk about the action roll itself. So the action roll, it mostly works well, I will say. It mostly works well. However, it does have its issues. The primary issue that I have, and what I've seen other GMs also have, this is, again, something I've seen, for example, on Friends at the Table. If you carefully watch what the dialogue is at the table, you can see what the sticking points are that come up again and again. And the one that comes up the most for me as a GM, and also from what I've seen other GMs, is this idea that the player must choose the action rating or the action that they use. They must choose the action they use. And I want to quickly read here what John Harper has to say about this decision, because I don't think it's without justification. It does make a certain sense. So he says, don't call for a specific action roll. This bad habit usually happens if you've GM'd other games where this is your job as the GM. You might say, give me a finesse roll, or that's a consort check. Try to get out of this habit. Get used to saying this instead. How do you do that? Ask the player which action they use. Then tell them the position and effect level that you see in this situation using that action, as well as why you think that. This lets you skip a tedious convincing phase where everyone has to debate about which action is the single right one to use. Don't have that debate. Just ask the player which action their character is performing, then set the position and effect. So they give an example, and then maybe you would make a different judgment call in the case above. Desperate position, 0 effect maybe, if you think finesse is all wrong for seductive persuasion. That's fine. Your game of Blades is your own. Plus, even when you say desperate position, 0 effect, you're not shutting the player down completely. They can push themselves for more effect, get a teammate to set them up for a better position, etc. It's not an argument between the GM and the player that one person has to win. It's just the normal back and forth interaction of the game. Instead of saying, you have to roll sway for this, you ask the player which action the character is performing, which gives the player the opportunity for a creative contribution to what's happening in the fiction. Then you put that action in context in the world as you see it by establishing position and effect. In theory, this is a very good system. However, there is a problem. There is a problem that I've experienced at the table a number of times. So the minor problem that is encountered in this is the one that John Harper points out, which is that you may be used to a different system where you call the shots, right? Where you do what I call parsing, right? It's like you're a text parser. You take input and you assign it to a move. So, for example, in PBTA games, the GM acts as a parser for player narration. The player says, I go up to the orc and I stab him in the face. Okay, so you're rolling hack and slash, right? Okay, so you're rolling hack and slash is the GM parsing out the narrative into a decision that the rule system can interpret, right? And that can have certain disadvantages, certainly. However, there are also disadvantages to the approach in Blades in the Dark, which would be, okay, so you say, the player says, I want to attack the orc. Okay, so what action are you rolling? This is where things fall apart. It says here, you ask the player which action the character is performing, which gives the player the opportunity for a creative contribution to what's happening in the fiction. Yes, certainly this gives the player an opportunity to interact directly with the rule system in a way that is creative because they're given a menu of options and they can choose from that menu. However, in practice, what happens is that many players are not sufficiently familiar with what the actions mean, or even if they are sufficiently familiar, they may lack the confidence to actually speak up and make a clear decision. So you end up getting into that problem of the back and forth over the convincing phase, right? The convincing phase kind of operates in reverse, is my experience, where normally it is the player lobbying the GM for an action. In the case of Blades in the Dark, it ends up being the GM first fishing for a player action, like, I'm going to give you leading questions. I'm going to present a situation. I'm going to keep narrating fiction. Where's the action roll? What action are you doing? Like, give me something to work with here. And the player will maybe make a decision, and in that case, it works fine. But more likely, they'll be like, is is it finesse? Is it consort? And then like they get flustered, and then you end up having the back and forth conversation over like, well, I think the definition of this action is more like this, but this one's more like that. And so it doesn't really avoid this problem unless the player has both a considerable knowledge of the rules. Of course, this goes for the GM as well, but it's part of play culture that GMs are expected to know the rules, so that's nothing surprising. They have to know the rules. Everybody has to know the rules, and also the player has to have a lot of confidence to speak up and make a decision. Now, is that a bad thing? Not really, right? Because as I said, in theory, this is a good system. The problem is that many players lack the confidence to be decisive. I'm a teacher. I see this all the time teaching students. They're taught to not. They're taught to doubt themselves, right? And I feel that maybe it's a lot of baggage of the education system, or just social pressure, or of play culture, tabletop play culture, that makes players doubt themselves. You see a big book like this and you think, oh, well, I couldn't possibly know what the right decision is here. And that ends up kind of throwing a wrench in the works. And I feel like that is the persistent problem we get with the action system in this game, is that it's not that the system is bad, it's that it doesn't conform to the existing play culture. And it expects way more of players than most tabletop RPGs do. So as a GM, you may find the start of a Blades campaign to be very frustrating. And players may feel that way as well. They may feel completely lost. I've seen that a number of times in actual plays or in my own experience at the table. So, buyer beware, right? Like, this is what you're signing up for if you're going to play Blades in the Dark. It can be very satisfying to have everybody contributing, but that requires that everybody be educated, ready, and confident, and feel like they're the adults at the table. All right, so let's continue. So the other parts of the action roll, the determination of position and effect, and so on, I think those work much more smoothly than the initial decision over which action to use. So some people that I've talked to are turned off by the outcome table. The outcome table, which is the one that tells you about how to, as a GM, how should you roll depending on the player's position, right? Let's see here. This one here. You're probably familiar with it, either from the player handout or from the text itself. So according to your controlled position, risky position, desperate position, and then your die result, you make a judgment on how the fiction follows from the roll. Some people look at this table and they say it's too complicated. It is something that is going to get in the way of the flow of play. I think that approaching something like this as... what I should say is, I think that in the case of Blades in the Dark, putting the flow of play above other considerations is probably a mistake. There's a lot of talk, meta talk in this game, and that's not a bad thing. The game works on that basis. So if you're used to playing a game that stays in the fiction and stays out of the metafiction, you may feel that there's too many sort of roadblocks or stopping points in the flow of play. But I would encourage you to give it a shot and see how it goes. And furthermore, I would say that these outcome tables are really no more complex than a PBTA move list, probably less so, in fact. And so, you know, or I mean, if we want to move away from the PBTA comparison, there's any number of games where the task resolution or the role resolution is far more complex than this. You know, you really just you look up the heading and then you look up the subheading and then you make your judgment. It can be a little bit difficult because you don't have the immediate structuring context of a move to tell you how to make a ruling. You only have the fiction that you've judged the position on. But judging the position and having the conversation about the action and the effect is already probably put you in a good enough situation to make a judgment as a GM. I personally find Blades in the Dark to be somewhat lower on the level of improv pressure than a PBTA game, and somewhat higher on the level of improv pressure than the Burning Wheel. How it relates to improv pressure in D&D, I guess it is a lot more, but there's a different kind of improv pressure in D&D where you have to have rules mastery and you also have to do a lot of on-the-fly matching of the rather rigid rule system to the fiction that you're working with. So yeah, I think the outcome tables are actually pretty good, and I don't agree with the criticisms of them. I think they're better than people think. As for setting effect, so that's, you know, judging based on position. Setting effect is a rather complex matter. There's a lot of factors to consider, right? You need to have a grasp of the immediate fiction, a grasp of the rules, and also you need to have a grasp of the context, right? The tier, right? Like the setting information is extremely important in making effect judgments in Blades in the Dark. The setting is mechanically active in a way that it's not in many other games, and therefore setting effect is a challenge. But as John Harper says, you don't really need to push yourself too hard on it to start. So I think that he says, he says right here on page 26, go with your gut and use simple or complex obstacles as you like, moment to moment in play. There's no hard and fast rule for what's simple or complex. And really, you can start off making rather simple judgments about effect. But I will say this. In the case of Blades in the Dark, there is the beginner's way to play it, the exoteric way to play it, right? The pick up and play version of Blades in the Dark, the way that you teach your players how to play the game, and the way that you learn yourself as a GM to run the game. And then there's how you really play Blades in the Dark. There is system mastery. It is relevant. It involves everybody at the table. In the case of setting effect, that is the GM's responsibility. And the way that you can get better at setting effect is, first of all, practice, right? That's important. But you also need to consider the factors. You need to know what the factors are, right? You need to think about potency. You need to think about quality and tier. You need to think about scale. You need to think about dominant factors in the immediate situation. And you need to think about how the setting and the fiction that you've created in your campaign influence the effect determination. And that is going to reap benefits, because the effect determination and the effect system in this game has wide-ranging repercussions. This is a mechanic that does a lot of heavy lifting, and I think it's important to invest the time to actually make use of it well, right? Um, what it does is it connects the roles you make in the action, right? Whether it's in free play, whether it's in a score, whether it's during downtime, it connects those action roles to both the setting, right? It makes DOSFall come alive because if you are going up against a higher tier faction or there's some dominant factor in the fiction that you've read in the setting description, it becomes immediately relevant. Like, okay, your effect level is higher or it's lower, and it matters, right? As long as you're making use of the effect system, it makes the fiction matter. The background fiction, right? The setting, it makes it matter, and it also makes the faction system in the game matter. So that time you invest in running the factions and doing the faction turns becomes immediately relevant in the action by way of setting effect. So what I would say about that in summary is, yes, setting effect is difficult. However, don't sweat it when you start, and as you keep playing, invest the time and energy to learn how to set effect in a way that is satisfying and helps make the entire flow of play sync together, right? Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the resistance roll. The resistance roll is, of course, something that the players can do to mitigate consequences. And I think this is a really brilliant system. The reason why I think it's brilliant is not just because it gives the players authority over the fiction, right? There are systems in other games where there's something similar to the resistance roll, right? Where the players have some kind of currency that they can spend in order to say, no, let's rewind, I want to do something different, or my character's going to get out of that situation, right? Like this, some kind of Benny or something they can spend. What's great about the resistance roll is that it is a structured mechanism for conversation. It gets a little bit deeper into the immediate situation and how and to what extent the player character is able to mitigate the consequences. It becomes an interesting conversation instead of just the player saying, nope, I don't like that, let's move on, right? It's not like an analog to the X card. If you are playing Blades in the Dark, it's not like because you have the resistance roll, you should not use the X card. The X card should also be there because there are things that some players simply do not want to see in the fiction at all, and that is beyond the scope of the rules of Blades in the Dark. So the resistance roll does not function as like a simple rewind. Instead, what it does is it creates a conversation over how much the effects of, or how much the consequences are reduced in severity. And are they reduced entirely? And what are the new effects that follow out of the resistance roll? It starts to create questions and dialogue, and that's something that this game excels at. And the resistance roll, I think, is really one of the kind of top examples of how that works so well. Right. So now let's move on to talking about clocks in the action. The usage of clocks is going to depend a lot on the GM. I think it's mostly going to be pretty idiosyncratic. Obviously, clocks out of the action, right? Clocks at the faction turn level, or in terms of downtime with long-term projects, are going to be much more common. Their usage will be more common. It'll be less idiosyncratic, and you'll see more similarity from one campaign to the next. But in the action, there's a lot of GM fiat in how much they want to use clocks and in what way they want to use clocks. So I can speak to my personal experience using clocks. I come from a background of being a PBTA GM, a Powered by the Apocalypse GM, and because of that, I think my instinct is to follow the consequences of rolls instead of setting up clocks and then knocking them down, right? I tend to just say, I've set the position in effect, that's good enough, let's see where this goes. Rather than having that mediating layer of the clocks. But that's not always true. Sometimes I do go to the clocks in the action. I use clocks to indicate the problems looming over the players. So if they're on a score, what are the sort of looming issues that they have to worry about, right? Like, are the guards going to come back? Is their hated rival going to show up? If you watched my last episode of Silkworms, my ongoing open table series of Blades, you can see that the ghost insight, whether they would show up during the score or not, was something I managed with a clock. In addition to that, in exceptional circumstances, like really exceptional circumstances, I will give an opponent a clock to work with. For example, I believe when in Silkworms, when Lug went up against the Master Warden, I made the Master Warden have a 10-segment clock to overcome. So it was like, that was a really serious opponent. I find the middle range of, the sort of mini-boss character to be maybe a little bit less interesting, and my personal tendency is to stick with the dice and stick with the roll system. But I can see the argument for trying out clocks there. And, I'm still developing my mastery of the game and my understanding of how to use clocks. But my overall point here is that they are useful. It's just that how they're used at the table is probably going to vary a lot from GM to GM. And this is a learning process. And in any case, I think that as a way of representing challenge in an action scenario, they are far superior to something like using challenge rating in D&D. I think that system is I don't think that it is a good system. I think that I much prefer the kind of GM fiat that is implied in clocks, within the context of this kind of collaborative and conversational play, compared to a system where there is antagonism between the GM and the players, and the rules by way of CR are just sort of going to step in and like flatten everything out, and say, okay, well, look, you groups of people, you can't get along, so we're just going to come in here and we're going to just like flatten out all the encounters so you follow a very precise power curve. I don't think that leads to interesting play in video games. I also don't think it leads to interesting play in role-playing games, in tabletop role-playing games. I much prefer, peaks and valleys, right? Having that variation in stimulus. That is something that the clock system and the position and effect systems in Blades actually allow to happen at the table in a way that something like CR does not. Okay, and so the last thing I want to talk about is stress. So stress is obviously a currency you can spend to get fictional things, but I think that the most interesting thing about stress is that it ties the scores and the downtime together, right? You always feel what I should say is you always feel the connection between the score you are in and the downtime that will follow, and then the score that will follow the downtime, because you are concerned with stress management. It really, really works well to tie together the phases of play. And what I think stress does most effectively is that it does something similar to what long rests and short rests were intended to do in D&D, which is to make to create interesting decision making outside of combat, and to create pacing to the game and continuity. But it realizes that idea in a far more satisfying way, because what it does is it creates interesting conversations about managing this stock, right? It is not a binary decision. It is not something you will tend to skip over, or at least, and this is something I will come to when I get to my overview of the game. If you are playing the game the way I think it is best played, you will not skip over stress relief. You will not treat it as a board game like currency. And I feel that the decision making that is made around something like short rest and long rest tends to be very like mechanics driven, perfunctory, doesn't lead to a lot of fiction. Whereas stress management in Blades, because of that possibility of overindulging, because of the connection to the stress purveyor, the vice purveyor, because of its relevance to character interactions, because of the way it ties together the entire structure of play, actually leads to a lot of interesting narrative production. And I think that it's great. It's fantastic. It's a really good system. So that does it for my discussion of the action system in this game. And in the next video, I want to talk about free play in Blades in the Dark. So I will see you then.